Welcome to Your World, a program about whatever is international at Central. I'm your host, Steve Horowitz. And the topic for today is cross-cultural marriage and work. And I'm very happy to have my guests with us today, Cesar Garcia and Jennifer Green, who are both on the faculty of the Communication Department and happen to be husband and wife. So welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks for having us.
And how long have you been at Central?
2 academic years.
And maybe just say something about the courses you teach or the area that your area specialization.
Well, I teach public relations courses plus intercultural communication, and
A little bit of...
and as a part of that, I teach international public relations, which is it's a sort of an intersection between public relations and intercultural communication.
And Jennifer, you
And I teach journalism classes, so I'm teaching an introduction to writing class. I teach a global media class on international media.
So you've been here a couple of years. Where were you before coming here? Were you, Cesar, you of course are from Spain, but were you in Spain before coming to Ellensburg?
Oh yeah, we were in Spain, we lived in Spain together. We met in San Francisco, moved to Spain together in
the 90s. At 97.
1997, and stayed in Madrid until we moved to Ellensburg. And we came direct Madrid to Ellensburg.
So you were in Spain for then how many years? About
I lived in Spain almost 11 years.
11
Cesar,
years.
of course, born and bred.
And
I'll repeat, we moved to Ellensburg sight unseen.
Sight unseen.
Yeah, Jennifer had not been in Ellensburg
Right.
when we moved.
So and in Spain, were you in Madrid most of the
Yes.
time?
Oh yeah. We traveled quite a bit, but we lived always in Madrid.
So right away I'm sure there would have been a kind of culture shock coming Madrid to Ellensburg. How was that transition for you?
Yeah. We always say it was surprisingly smooth. You know, for a lot of reasons. You're obviously different countries, different cultures, different languages, and then living in a very cosmopolitan, very big city like Madrid and moving to such a small town. And neither of us had ever lived in a small town before. So
in the U.S., you lived in...
I lived basically Baltimore half my life and San Francisco the other half, and around San Francisco.
So a kind of culture shock also in terms of places in the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you have kids, right? How old are they?
Gabby turns 5 this week, and Teresa just turned 2.
So probably the adjustment for them was...
Pretty.
It was very easy because at those ages they don't even... For them it's like a game.
As long as there's a park nearby, they're happy.
So you met in, just to recap, you met in San Francisco, and when you went to Spain, had you been there before? Was that
I had, yeah, and it's really funny actually to go back and look at the pictures. I was there as a tourist with my parents in 1989, I think it was, and we were in Madrid, I think, for 1 or 2 nights doing sort of a Eurail trip around Europe. I think we had 5 countries in, or 6 countries in, 3 weeks or something like that. 2 nights in Madrid. And yeah, looking back at the pictures now, knowing where those locations are in the city, we were in really random places. I don't know sort of how we ended up in the places that we toured on that trip. So that's a lot of fun. So yeah, I'd been there.
So one of the fundamental questions I wanted you to kind of explore is, what have you found to be the challenges, if you can separate them out, because we all have challenges in our marriages, but the challenges that are specific to being from different cultures and having to adjust to life in both, since you've lived both places. Maybe I'll ask each of you that question.
I think we have found probably more opportunities than challenges. Like when you asked me to do this interview, I thought, well, you know what, I haven't thought about that. So, and it's because we don't consider ourselves necessarily perfect representatives of our cultures.
Right, that's true too.
And because the truth is that when we talk about culture, we talk about values, beliefs, social norms, practices. That's what I teach my students in intercultural class. And the truth is that we don't really have, our values or beliefs are not very different from the beginning. Right. So it's really not, hasn't been very challenging from that point of view.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. I think values, beliefs, a lot of similarities. You know, the core differences, I would say, are probably more superficial.
More the social practices or norms.
And you can get over those. And also our families, maybe. You know, when we first moved to Spain, we stayed with Cesar's parents for a while, and I remember thinking at the big meal in Spain is lunch, and we would sit at the lunch table, all of us around. Cesar has brothers and their wives, and people would be shouting. You know, just all of this loud noise and loud discussions. And at the time, my Spanish wasn't that great, so I couldn't even follow the full discussion. And I remember thinking, why are they really argue a lot? You know, they seem like they're not getting along. And I sort of slowly, or actually quickly, came to realize that people just talk louder and you know, have bigger conversations like that over the lunch. We're much more staid, and at least in my family. But that's nothing that's going to...
How about other differences? And you feel that the values, fundamentally your values are similar, and that the cultural differences don't really affect those underlying values very much. How about just some of the behavior or customs, like you mentioned, you know, how people conduct themselves at meals?
And I would say, again, superficial stuff, like meals. So, you know, mealtime, lunch being a larger meal, maybe, you know, several dishes as opposed to us, you know, Americans tend to eat on the run and et cetera. We don't necessarily sit down as a family to have meals. Scheduling, again, it's pretty superficial. It's not going to make or break a marriage, but you know, things happen later in Spain. You get up a lot. You get up a little bit later. You, especially in Ellensburg, where the sun rises at 5 in the morning. You have lunch at 2 o'clock in Spain, and lunch lasts at least an hour, maybe 2. You have dinner quite a bit later. We sort of settled at a maybe 8 o'clock range, but people dine as late as 10 o'clock. If you get a reservation at a restaurant in Spain before 9:30, you're the only person in the
How about the relationships within the family? Like, of course, you have children, so grandparents are going to be important. You know, people, especially for your children. I mean, because they're your parents, but grandparents always want to have some role, usually with the grandchildren.
Yeah, and you do see parenting differences, different styles, but you know, for the most part, all of the grandparents want to spend as much time as they can with the grandkids, which you know, that does make it hard when you come from a marriage that people are so spread apart. So we see Cesar's family now only in the summers.
So do you communicate in both languages? Do you want your children to learn both languages? So your Spanish now is, would you say your Spanish is fluent?
Yeah, oh yeah.
So
yeah. Well, and you know, that was a result of moving to Spain and sort of sink or swim. I started working within months of moving there, and as a journalist, and sort of had to conduct interviews in another language. I had to learn quickly. But yeah, we're very concerned that our kids learn both languages.
Yeah, that's probably the most difficult part for me of living in Ellensburg, is that thing, because it's difficult. You have to be very disciplined at home, but that's not enough. You need more. I mean, there's not, for example, we find a problem because the schools don't offer Spanish classes at any level.
What about some of the differences? The other part of the equation is the differences in working in Spain and the U.S. Now, you were a professor in Spain. And you worked as a journalist or also a professor, teacher?
Yes, both.
We did both. I was doing public relations, and I was an adjunct over there.
So can you say something about some of the differences in
Sure, and I was going to say, one of the differences that comes straight to mind was your schedule, working for a public relations company. The hours were quite long.
Yeah, the work schedules are different because you have this big break in the middle of the day. That is not necessarily to take a siesta, because nobody takes a siesta.
How many hours break?
A couple of hours in many companies. I mean, in my industry, it was flexible. You want to stay in the office, you stay in the office, but you cannot leave before 7. So better if you take a break. And yeah, that was probably the biggest difference in terms of work, the schedules.
And my work, I was sort of in a special situation because I worked. Mostly as a freelancer, as a journalist. So for the first few years I worked out of, I was working for ABC Television. I worked out of the correspondent's home as her production assistant. And then I moved into working more full-time for the magazine that I was writing for, and I worked out of my home. So I have never worked in an office in Spain. I did when I very first moved there, before I picked up journalism work, I taught English, so I would travel and I would go into companies to teach classes, but don't have the experience.
She was teaching English in my company.
Yeah, I was teaching English at his company. Yeah,
that's where you met?
No.
No, we met in San Francisco. But so I have sort of a different take on working in Spain because I set my own schedule and I worked out of my home. And
what about some of the differences between teaching at a university, and you taught at a university in Spain, and here? There got to be some significant
My
differences.
experience teaching in Spain is not probably as representative because I was teaching in a Jesuit university, private, and with very particular kind of students. It was very international. Maybe 50% of the students were American students spending a semester in Spain or maybe 1 year.
So that's one big difference between that school and CCU.
Yeah, another 25% international students, people from many different countries, and another 25% of Spanish students, all of them in the same class. And it was it's difficult to say with that mix of.
Based on your knowledge of the Spanish education system, maybe our viewers would be interested in knowing what are some of the major differences between, let's say, university education in Spain and in the U.S.
Well, I was graduated in '92, but I think things may have changed. But I think basically the main idea is that here in the United States, when you go to college, is the transition period between being a teenager and become an adult. Is this sort of initiatic rite? In Spain, that's not the case because people don't move far from home to go to college,
with their parents.
And that makes a big difference. You can go to college and live with your parents.
So it's more of a continuation of what you were doing.
Yeah,
before.
let's say it that way. And in that sense, it's not. I think in the United States, it's a bigger deal to go to college. In Spain, it was a big deal in the 70s because until the 70s, people who went to college, well, it was sort of elitist to go to college. But after the 70s, universities became crowded.
What about the demands that, in general, if there's a way to comment, the demands that the universities make on students in Spain versus U.S., just based on your
The demands on the students?
The demands on the students, well as on the faculty.
Well, I think probably here it's more... And I'm talking about my university, which is it would be more the equivalent to a research one here. So my education was based on lectures, maybe a couple of tests, one midterm, one at the end of the class, and maybe a paper or two.
More papers, you think?
A lot more, yeah. Here it's much more, in that sense, it's more based in group assignments and
more interaction with the professor.
More interaction with the professor.
Here?
Yeah. Than at least in my university.
How about the costs? Are there some of the costs in Spain covered by the government, or is it all?
Yeah, basically the student only pays between 5 and 10%. It's basically free. So that's a problem because even if you are not a good student, the system provides you many opportunities.
So what about the selectivity of the universities as far as students getting admitted?
There is a big test for everybody who finishes high school that everybody has to take, and it's like a state test. So there is it's like the yardstick of how you perform in your high school. So to make sure that you didn't perform very well in a very easy high school, and other people who went to a harder high school. But yeah, there is a system of grades. So if you want to study, for example, to become an engineer, you need to have a higher grade than if you want to become a journalist. But people tend to study, and I think that's something that should be corrected in the region. So if I live in Madrid, I don't move to Barcelona to study. I stay in Madrid. And that's probably not very enriching.
It's kind of it maybe reinforces the regional point of view.
It's sort of endogamic in that sense.
Well, I'd like to go back for a minute to the marriage issue. I know that you said you don't have any fundamental cross-cultural marriage issues, which is great, but I'm wondering if you know other couples, you must know other couples who are in a cross-cultural marriage, and you maybe have seen, I've seen people who have struggled with different cross-cultural issues. Is there any advice that you would give to a couple who are just starting out?
I would definitely say, not to take for granted the cross-cultural differences. That if we both teach communications. Communication is something that can be very different across cultures. If you're finding that you're somehow not communicating well, if you're finding that the families are, very different in some way, that not to push those differences aside, but to deal with them and to recognize them for what they are and to accept them as well. Not say, oh, I'm going to change the way this person's doing things and try to make it the way we're doing things. And that might work if it's a couple who, say, meets in one country and stays in that country. In our case, because we are pretty fluid and we've gone, when we were living in Spain, we would spend as much time in the summers and sometimes at Christmas as we could in the United States. So Cesar had quite a lot of experience already almost living here in the United States. And now that we're living here, we're spending a couple of months, if we can, in the summers in Spain. So we're still going back and forth between the cultures.
Seems like in some relationships the challenge might be different if both people do not speak each other's languages and they're always communicating in one language, I would imagine.
I think the biggest challenge is, and not for us, but for a lot of couples, is where to live, where you are going to grow up,
That's true.
Your kids.
Children complicate the issue,
who is going to be far from his or her family. Those are the biggest challenges.
Yeah, I know I've heard that some cross-cultural marriages get a lot of pressure from the families to do exactly that, to move to one country or the other. Sounds like you found a good balance.
We've been really lucky.
Well, because we have been happy there and we are happy here. It's like we don't necessarily are biased by, we have to live here. No, and I know some couples that, because they didn't agree about that issue, they live in a third country. Some people, we met some people who live in Spain because he was British and she was Italian, or no, he was Italian and she was British, and they live in Madrid.
They're moving to London, though. I got an email.
Well, that would be interesting to see over the long term how they deal with or how they cope with living outside both of their countries.
And really, children do complicate the issue, because I remember somebody telling me when I first moved to Spain that no matter how long you stay in Spain, the country where you grow up is always going to be fundamentally your culture and your country and your language. It's your maternal instinct to say. And our son was 3 when we moved here, despite all of my efforts to speak English in the home, to show English cartoons. I sent him to an English language preschool we did in Madrid. We didn't know we'd be moving back to the States. He still preferred Spanish until the age of 3. And we moved here, and now the opposite is true. And I even said to Cesar the other day, I said, you're bringing up American kids basically now, and how does that make you feel?
Well, if they're raised here as Americans and they go back to Spain, then we'll have some.
Well, we actually had a friend who grew up in Toronto. He's Canadian, and his father is Spanish. He lives in Spain now, and he spent his summers in Spain, he always liked to live there, and he moved there.
And he's an interesting case because he's trilingual. His mother spoke French, his father Spanish, and he grew up in Toronto. He speaks English. He's fluent in all 3 languages, and he's fluent culturally as well. He can he and his wife lived in Brussels, I think, before they moved to Madrid, right? And he felt comfortable there as well. So he's very fluent in all 3 cultures. And he was one of the people who suggested to us as well that with kids, in terms of creating a kind of bilingual environment for them, that it's not enough to be fluent just speaking, but you also have to really teach them to write and to read in the second language, which is which is more our concern with the schooling, because he'll get our children both get the Spanish at home and in the summers, as long as we're here, but they won't necessarily be taught to.
And of course, speaking about learning the culture, learning about the culture of Spain, you're going to be taking a group of Central students to Spain this summer. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It's going to be great.
Well, it's a combination of we call it academic tourism. So it's a trip with the academic content. We're going to teach the students how the communication landscape is configured in a different country, and they will have to do an assignment, like a final project.
So are you going to be teaching classes every day in Spain, or are you going to be attending?
We don't want to keep them in a hotel once they, they've got 15 days in Madrid. We don't want to.
No, but we're going to bring over guest speakers, and we're going to do media tours. We'll probably do the less talking, because to talk to us. They can talk to us here, but
and
how many students are going?
We've got about 15, I think, or 13.
14.
14. And They're mostly communication students, mostly public relations and journalism students, and so we're going to take them on tours of PR agencies. We'll take them on tours of
that sounds great.
newspapers and news agencies.
So knowledge of the language is not required.
No, because I think that nobody speaks
no, I don't
Spanish.
think
Are they doing some
only one
preparation?
person
Are they
speaks.
doing some preparation now? Did you ask them to do some study about Spain, Spanish
Well, we're going to
culture?
have a session
Yeah.
prior to the trip. A
And
long
it's 2
session.
weeks? Is it?
As far as I can tell, the students are pretty interested on their own to be already.
How long
looking
exactly?
into-
Did you
11
mention?
days.
It's 11
Oh,
days.
11
Yeah.
days.
Yeah.
So it's entirely in Madrid.
No, it's Madrid and surroundings.
There's a short tour built into it of I think Avila, Segovia.
Yeah, that's during the
Salamanca.
weekend, but the rest of the time is in Madrid. I mean, the thing is that because we have the academic requirements, we had to be.
Right.
And we are talking about communication, where Madrid is
So
the
some
place
guest
to
speakers,
be.
as you said, and visits to
Yeah.
relevant
It would have been nice
places.
to be able to go to Barcelona because
I
Barcelona
wanted
is
to do
also a
it, but
communication hub.
it was a
It's
lot more
just-
expensive,
added to
and
the cost.
it's already 2 or 3 days out of the way.
Well, I hope you can get lots of photos and maybe some film, and we can have you back on the show later on to talk about what
The
you
trip.
experienced or what the students
Absolutely.
experienced
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
how that went.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you both very much for being on the show.
Sure.
And have a great trip to Spain this summer.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
And thank you for joining us, and hope you'll tune in to Your World next time.